Welcome to our program, Through the Pandemic, Tales from China. I'm Michael Wong here in Beijing. Well, today we are joined by a group of young international expats who have experienced the pandemic here in China. Over the past 3 years, they have managed through challenges and obstacles, as well as discovered unexpected opportunities and touching moments. They have a wealth of stories, a wealth of insights and perspectives to share with us. So we hope their experiences will shed more light on the broader issues of global health, of cross-cultural communication, as well as human resilience. We have a group of guests who are joining us online and offline here in our studio as well. I want to first introduce our guests who are joining us online. They are Adam Sayed, who is a Central Committee member of the Lebanese Communist Party. Alina Steblianskia, who is an associate professor at the Harbin Engineering University. Shamim Zakaria is a journalist and commentator from India. Joseph Olivier Mendo is the head delegation of the African Youth in China and also the co-founder of the China-Africa Youth Federation. Kate Kaligayeva is a Yenching scholar at Peking University, and Alberto Andrea Najarro is studying environmental science and public policy, aiming to become a science-literate decision maker. So thank you all to all of our guests who are joining us online. And joining me in the studio, we have Gisela Cernadas, who is an economist from Argentina. Gisela, you're also a member of Dongsheng News, a columnist at Barricada TV, at ARG Medios, and a member of the No Cold War campaign. So Gisela, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're also joined by Marco Fernandes, who is a researcher at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. And Marco, you're from Brazil.
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks for having me here.
So Marco, welcome to you on the program as well. Okay, so we have quite a diverse range of people in terms of backgrounds, in terms of geographies as well. So I want our audience to get a better sense of where everybody is coming from and perhaps what they're currently working on here in China. So we just heard from Adam. Alina, how about we come to you and maybe give us a little bit more background in terms of when did you come to China and what you're currently working on here in China from beautiful, but I'm assuming still quite cold Harbin in northeast China.
Thank you so much. Yes, my name is Alina. I'm from Harbin Engineering University School of Economics and Management, and long-term engaged into the environmental economics, energy economics, and complex economics research through the Belt and Road. And I'm very proud of the fact that I survived through COVID-19 period pandemic with the Chinese nation. So I've come to China 3 years ago to Harbin Engineering University, and over the past 3 and maybe 3.5 years in Harbin, stay in Harbin. Through the pandemic period, I already participated in more international projects, so it's like so many stories, you know.
Fantastic, great. Alina, welcome again. And then Shamim, how about I come to you? Maybe give our audience a little bit more about your background.
Sure, I'm Shamim Zakaria. I'm a journalist and commentator. I'm currently based in Beijing, and I'm originally from India, but I have been based in China for the past 6 years. And all throughout the pandemic, I was in Beijing, to be honest. And yeah, pandemic has been a really sort of a very intriguing experience. There has been a lot of stories about people's resilience, how people pivoted in their lives. And also it was like an emotional reckoning for a lot of us, because we as expats, we were in China and we were far away from our homes. So the only mode of communication with our home was online. But of course, like during the pandemic, our family was worried because you know how the situation would unfold in China. But thankfully, I have had like really smooth ride. Of course, there were some sort of rough patches in between, but overall it was a smooth ride. If I were to talk about my employer, they really cared about our well-being, our health. And also in terms of our flexibility, they adjusted in terms of how the situation was unfolding. Sometimes we were working remotely, and sometimes we were working from office. But overall, it was a very interesting experience. And I'm sure, during the pandemic, I spoke to a lot of people who were there during the SARS epidemic, and they used to say that during SARS, this used to happen. So I feel that the positive thing that I'm taking from, of course, apart from all the other things I'm taking from the pandemic is that, now pandemic is over. We are back to almost pre-COVID normalcy. And then in the future generations, when I'll be speaking to people, I'll definitely be able to, recall these stories about human resilience and how people came together, the spirit of community. And I think this will something I'll carry on for the rest of my life.
Great, thank you for that, Shamim. You actually touched upon 2 points that I wanted to explore a little bit more with all of our guests in terms of did everyone have that community of support with them during the pandemic years? Because it might be a little bit more taxing on the mind. And then you talk about resilience as well. And that's also a topic that I want to explore with the rest of our colleagues online and here in the studio today. So Shamim, thank you so much for sharing with that with us early on in the program. Dr. Mendoza, I want to come to you because you also did a doctorate at Peking University, School of International Studies, if I'm not mistaken. So if you could introduce yourself a little bit more about your background and what you're currently working on here in China.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm Olivier Mendoza. I'm from Cameroon in Central Africa. So in China, this is the 6th year. I've been in China for, I would say, 6.5 years. And yeah, definitely completed my PhD at Peking University. But in the meantime, due to the fact that I also spent quite some time in Chinese counties, I've been to more than 35 actually at a county level, just to, there are many ways to understand China. So this is the way, apart from the academic, environment, I also chose to go to a lot of Chinese counties. So I serve as the head delegation of the African youth in China. So quite a busy schedule to actually have to handle the entire African community, including mainland and the other 2 parts. I also I set up a platform with Chinese, with Chinese young leaders, which is the China Africa Youth Federation. It was also to establish a communication sort of platform. And I was in China during COVID since 2020. I haven't left since. And, did a lot of, we were very busy, very, very busy because when it comes to Africa and China. So basically, I think I will intervene later on in the discussion, but that's a rough introduction about myself.
Fantastic. Welcome to the program, Dr. Mendoza. You mentioned 35 counties, and I just want to get a geographical sense in terms of where these 35 counties are located across the country. So these 35 counties that you visited, are they pretty much broadly dispersed from north, south, east, west?
From north, south, east, west, from Xinjiang, Guizhou, Gansu, and then you have Suzhou, pretty much all over China.
Okay, fantastic. Kate, let me come to you. I think Peking University is really well represented on this panel. We've got how many people? Maybe 2 or 3 people from Peking University today. Kate, maybe tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background and where you're from, please.
Very true. Thank you so much, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. So I come from a small but very beautiful country of Belarus, located in Eastern Europe. And I've been in Beijing, China over 3 years now. I completed my degree in Tsinghua University, majoring in journalism and communication studies. So I've been back home for over a year during pandemic, but then was really lucky to come back to China in 2021. So I would say that I've experienced a very unusual university student life as an undergraduate student here. I must say that it was very unusual because we had a lot of online exams, online thesis defense, even online graduation. But thanks to a great community of teachers and students on the university, we've managed to support each other and to maintain a pretty, stable, nice lifestyle on campus. So I'm really glad that I did it. And right now, as I'm doing my master's degree in Peking University, I think I'm very happy that things are back to life. We're doing a lot of field trips this semester and everyone's, getting back to the normal pace of life. So I'm very happy about it.
Yeah.
Although difficulties in pandemic, I'm still very lucky because I had the chance to visit one of the greatest events in my life, which is Winter Olympics. And I did a lot of media reporting on that because I also work in media myself. Also, I visited around 7 or 8 provinces in China despite the pandemic, lockdowns, and restrictions. So I feel I'm still very lucky, and I had a lot of opportunities to do because there were not many students here in China. So I got a lot of chances to explore China, to deeply dive in the various cultures of Guizhou, Guangdong province, Hainan, etc. So I still feel very lucky to be here.
Let's come to our studio guest, and Gisela, if you could talk a little bit more about what you do as an economist from Argentina and also the various media organizations you represent.
Yeah, sure. So first, thanks again for having me here. It's a pleasure to be sharing the experience with everybody today. Well, as you mentioned, I'm economist, so I contribute from that side to some international projects of cooperation between peoples of the Global South through what is the International Association for Popular Cooperation, basically doing some consulting. And I also contribute to some media based in Argentina and with the Dongsheng News Collective, realizing that, well, the media was being weaponized against China. So being here and witnessing what China was doing was way different from what Western media was saying. I decided to contribute with this project and tell stories about China from China, trying to bring different ideas to the people in the West.
I think you raise a very important point, Gisela, in terms of if you really want to understand China, I think you owe it to yourself to at least come to the country and maybe stay for 2 weeks, maybe up to a month, travel around the country and get a better sense, I think, of China works and how real life functions here in China. So Gisela, thank you for that. Marco, what about you?
Well, I'm from Brazil. I'm a researcher. My background is history in a BA and master, and then I did a PhD in social psychology, also in Brazil. So I work for Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. I also participate of the Dongsheng News Collective, one of the co-founders. And well, my experience was very curious because I arrived in China 2 days before they started the mandatory quarantine for people coming from abroad, 14 days. And actually 1 week after I arrived, they closed the border. So for me, it was just like the last minute. And at the same time, I escaped from the COVID in Brazil because at that point, COVID was starting in Brazil. So actually, the first 2 years of COVID here in China, my experience was, I mean, we had a normal life. I used to live in Shanghai. I mean, there was nothing in Shanghai in the first 2 years, pretty normal life. And was actually sometimes, I mean, talking to my friends in Brazil, my family, friends in Africa, we used to feel a little bit guilty because, I mean, people were suffering so much, especially the first year with no vaccines. I mean, a lot of people dying. In my country, Brazil, 700,000 people died. It's actually one of the worst rates in COVID in the planet. Brazil has like 3% of the population of the planet, but we had 11%, almost 12% of the COVID death overall. So for me, of course, I feel privileged, but at the same time a bit guilty because, I mean, the situation in my country was really terrible, especially during the first 2 years of COVID.
Yeah. So Marco and Gisela, it seems like you arrived in China when the outbreak really started spreading, and then it turned into a global pandemic quite soon. So I want to get your thoughts in terms of how did you feel maybe, and how did you respond when you heard that this thing really was serious and it's affecting all countries in the world? Gisela?
Well, I can start saying that I landed in China on February 20 of 2020. So it was just right after the lockdown in Shanghai was ended.
Yeah.
And my first feeling in this route from the airport to the city center was, what did I do? Why did I come to China in this moment when everybody is saying that this is very dangerous? And I realized that actually there were a lot, it was plenty of different care measures that you can take, like wearing the face mask, taking the PCR test, or maintaining some social distance at some point. Even though it was at the beginning of the pandemic and the scientific knowledge that we have about the virus and how this is spread was quite little compared to the knowledge that the scientific community has today, I realized that actually it was pretty safe. And that all my fears, all the things I had in my mind, reading that China was having this, terrible moment, was quite different in reality. So as Marco said, I also felt pretty guilty because I was living a very safe life here, pretty safe life. And the rest of the world, unfortunately, people were dying. So
Yeah. I think the official death toll right now for COVID globally is close to 7 million people around the world, unfortunately. So I do want to get maybe some comparison here and come back to Alberto on this point. If you could explain to our audience a little bit more in terms of the different ways regions and countries dealt with the pandemic. And just a note for all our panelists joining online and offline, we want to make this into a conversation. So if any of you want to follow up on a point that another guest has said, feel free to just raise your hand, and if I see you, jump into the conversation. If you want to add on to something, if you want to expand, if you want to refute on something, let me know. So Alberto, you mentioned you also lived in North America and Latin America and here in China as well during the past 3 years. So maybe give us a better sense of what you went through and the different ways that different countries dealt with it. Of course, we know China had this dynamic COVID measure where it tried to buy as much time as possible to build up its medical resources to save as many people as possible, which is different perhaps compared to what other countries did. And I don't want to make a judgment call in terms of who's right and who's wrong. It's just different people with different cultures had different ways of dealing with the pandemic. So Alberto, if you could share with our audience a little bit more in terms of what you saw around the world in terms of how different people dealt with the pandemic.
Yes, of course, Michael. As I mentioned before, I was in China when the pandemic was just getting started. And my classmates and my university, we made the decision that it was probably better for us to go back home because we did not know what was going to happen. So I was in China for the first, in January 2020. And the experience was, we did not understand how the virus was spreading, how it functioned. I remember going with my friends to the grocery store, getting some food because we had canceled our trip for Chinese New Year. And at that point, everything was okay. I went back home to El Salvador. If I'm not mistaken, I arrived on January 27, 2020. And at that point, El Salvador had already started to implement some measures. I remember arriving to the airport. I had taken a route from Shanghai to Amsterdam, then Panama, then El Salvador. And El Salvador was the only airport where I had a temperature check. It was very early. No one really knew what was happening, but they did ask me, where are you coming from? How long were you there? And I had to share my contact information just in case they needed to reach out to me. I think that for the year and a half that I was in El Salvador, which is most of the time in my experience with COVID, we had lockdowns. We did have, most of us had to remain at home. I was still completing my degree online through Duke Kunshan University classes and also Duke University classes. And at that point, the issue was that we did not know what was going to happen when I would go back to China or if I would go back to the United States, because the approach that each government took and each country took was different. When I was in El Salvador, we did not have vaccines at some point until through the international community decided to donate some of them to us, including China. If I'm not mistaken, China was the first country to donate vaccines to El Salvador. In fact, my grandmother and my father got a Sinovac, the first doses of the Chinese COVID-19 vaccine. So I'm very grateful for that. And for my senior year, for my fourth year of university, I went to the United States, where we had temperature checks and mandatory COVID tests every 72 hours at Duke University in the United States. So that did give us a sense of safety because we knew the status of our health. I did get COVID the first time in the United States, in New York, during a winter break. I just had to quarantine at home for a week at my friend's home, and that was it. So the experience, I believe that in the United States, at my university, it was mandatory for us to have COVID vaccines and COVID tests. But in many other parts of the country, it was not. So that led to some issues. In El Salvador, it also became mandatory for us to take a COVID-19 vaccine. But I took my first COVID-19 vaccines in the United States because they were not available for my age range at that time. But I think the experience was, it was at different stages in the pandemic. In El Salvador, we did not have vaccines. We did not know what was happening. In the United States, we had already developed an understanding of the virus. And now I'm here in China, where now the pandemic is over and we can just go back to normal. So that's a great privilege to be here during this time.
Yeah, and would love to get everybody's thoughts in terms of your post-pandemic plans here in this country as well. I want to come to Alina now because we have a few people right now in university and still studying. And Alina, I just want to get your thoughts in terms of how you managed through the pandemic while teaching, and what happened with the teaching staff, with the students, and how the university over where you are, Harbin Engineering University, went through these past 3 years.
Thank you that you raised that so amazing and important question. So in Harbin Engineering University, I saw an example of how to behave towards people in a good manner, without conflicts and without disregard each other. For example, I saw the teachers who, nevertheless, their difficult circumstances, and nevertheless, the pandemic hardships and turbulences, always take care about students as a priority. And I saw before me the sacrifice of Chinese teachers in front of the students. And this fact was really amazing. And so I want to arise a theme of maybe why we so underestimate the teachers through the COVID-19 pandemic period. For example, you know, the early pandemic days, we all admired of doctors, yes, and proud of them, wondering and proud of them. For example, with my daughter, we very often saw the film Chinese Doctors, Zhongguo Yishen, where we can see the heroic doctors and how they prevent struggle with COVID-19 pandemic in the early period. Why we have no such film about Chinese teachers? Because of Chinese teachers help us to be strong, to be healthy, to take care about students, about children, nevertheless of their circumstances. For example, Chinese teachers taught us that task ahead of us is never greater than the strength inside of us. So we can say thanks to Chinese teachers for the memories of their days, for their maybe for their caring about students, for their brotherly and friendly support. Let us say to Chinese teachers, university teachers, high school, middle school, primary school teachers, you are great. You have done so much for the society. Thank you.
Yeah, you also bring up a fantastic point, Alina, because I feel like during the past 3 years, not just here in China, but everywhere around the world, you have ordinary people becoming heroes as well in terms of making a lot of sacrifices for the greater good. And on that note, Shamim, I want to come to you because we're talking about perhaps cross-cultural differences. And again, I'm not making any judgment calls in terms of who's right or who's wrong, but perhaps just different cultural traditions in different countries. Shamim, do you get the sense that perhaps here in China, when fighting the pandemic, there was a greater sense, and there still is a greater sense of perhaps coming together, unity in society to promote a common good, I guess, in these pandemic years? Because of course, there were certain pandemic control measures. Some people were okay with this. Some people might have been a little bit frustrated. Some people still want those pandemic control measures back because they feel safer. But do you get the sense, Shamim, that in China, there is a sense of perhaps uniting for the common good a little bit more compared to other parts of the world? And I want to get your take on maybe how India went through all of this as well.
Yes, absolutely. Firstly, we all agree to the fact that this is a pandemic unseen in a century, and when it happened, like government across the country, across the globe, were taken off guard, like how to deal with this sort of health emergency, and every country. When they implemented the measures, it was best suiting to their domestic conditions. Right now, when the pandemic happened in China, that time, of course, I was in China, so I was starting to get a lot of calls from my friends back or family members back home, and they were telling me that why don't you like come back to India for a while and just stay and let the situation subside and then you return to China. But from my experience of staying in China, not just the pandemic but just looking at how the government or how things are micromanaged at the community level, I was pretty sure that it was a matter of time and China would be able to I was very optimistic that China will be able to control the situation pretty well. Even though at that time I didn't know that it will go on for so long. But yes, having said that, definitely China managed it very well. And as I said at the beginning, that the community spirit, the pandemic has brought communities together in unique ways. And I have seen how people have been volunteering to deliver groceries to vulnerable individuals or supporting local businesses. And this has definitely fostered a sense of community spirit and solidarity. And this trend has built upon to promote social cohesion, if I have to say that, and support the most vulnerable members of the society. And I would like to give you a small example. At the beginning of the pandemic, when it just happened, I was part of that WeChat social media group of my residential community, and I remember because I was a foreigner, of course, and people knew that, and of course they were worried that I would not be able to get a sense of what was happening. So a lot of the people were asking me about if I was getting the regular COVID test, if everything was okay, and even our community delivered food to my doorsteps. So that was something like that really touched me, because here I'm a foreigner in a different country, but then these people were taking care of me, because I might not have a sense of what was happening. And now if I look at comparison in India, so there was, when the pandemic first happened in China, a lot of people have this misconception that the entire China was in lockdown, but which is not the case. Of course, only Wuhan was put under lockdown, and there were, like, say, closure of management in different places depending on the situation. But in India, if I see, India had one of the most stringent lockdowns in the world. And you might have seen a lot of videos going viral how the authorities really crack down on any people violating that. So, and I was getting calls from people as well. And when I was talking to people back home, yes, there were like a lot of because the lockdown was announced all of a sudden, and people are having difficulties in managing, getting their daily supplies, or even like getting their emergency supplies like medicines and all. But when it's coming to China, of course, there were challenges. I would definitely agree, but it was not at that scale. The government pretty much managed it very well, and I would definitely have to give credits to the grassroots cadres, because of course governments might implement some rules, but government might roll on some rules, but actual implementation depends on those grassroots volunteers or people at the grassroots level. And that actually shows the community spirit. And a lot of the people I have seen, they were just doing it as a voluntary work, and that actually shows the resilience and community spirit. And this is something like I have spoken about in different platforms about my experience in China.
Fantastic. I think you bring up several great points, Shamim, because people outside of China perhaps don't understand the concept of these community level organizations. So the organizational capabilities of China, I think, are absolutely incredible. Because of the community organizations, we can stop the outbreaks as fast as possible here in China, and therefore to try our best to make sure life can become as normal as possible. Because I remember back in 2021, actually, I traveled quite a lot as well in terms of going to several different provinces across the country. And of course, we had the pandemic back then as well. But because you had these community organizations that were able to stop the outbreaks as soon as possible, that also allowed life to resume as normal as possible as well. So thank you for sharing that. These grassroots level organizations, I think we've all experienced people delivering groceries into our apartment buildings. And I think it's just very heartwarming to have that kind of support system. Adam, I want to come to you and get your reflections in terms of your experiences, perhaps social distancing here in China, and as well as perhaps some of your coping mechanisms that you went through in the past 3 years as well. Adam?
Yeah, look, like my experience here, it's a little different, because I was in Wuhan at that time, and I was, of course, like in the university and studying. And if you remember, in the first 2-3 days, there is a lot of rumors, a lot of fake news. People start to be afraid. And actually, we don't know a lot about the virus. I'm coming from a place that I don't know a lot about what's mean virus, how to deal with this situation. So for me, I had the opportunity to go out China. If you remember, in the first week, many countries they evacuated students from Wuhan, but I decided to stay in Wuhan. And that at that time, I asked myself, so okay, what I will do if I stay in Wuhan, you know? So I said, because at that time I was watching something happening in my country, in Lebanon, and people start to use live stream videos on Facebook to show what's happening in Lebanon. So I said, okay, I will stay here to show the world what's really happening in Wuhan. You know, not what we hear on the media and other all those things. So I start to go out in the street and shoot videos, you know, live videos. And I believe maybe I was the first one. I did it for all China media. So, and since that time, the situation in Wuhan, it was, okay, it was so hard, but it was amazing. You know, what we learned from what's happening there, it was amazing. And I'm like Kamin and Alina. Alina said, like, we have to say thanks, and you did a great job for teacher. But I believe it's not only for teacher. What about volunteer? What about QID people, those delivery people? They did a great job, you know? Maybe now we cannot remember what happened at the time, but without those people, we can do nothing. How they organized everything, the scientists, the medical team. I remember in the first week, I think it was the Chinese New Year, thousands of nurses, doctors, they come from all around China to Wuhan, you know, and at that time we start to feel strong, like there is people who are coming to support us. So of course we will win this war, if I can say war. So my experience is a little different, because in the first 1.5 years of the pandemic, I was there, and I witnessed the pandemic, like the lockdown, the great lockdown, maybe for 3 months in Wuhan.
Yeah, you also bring up an interesting point, Adam. I think that's very unique to China's way of fighting the pandemic, is that you have medical teams from different provinces as well, going to perhaps areas where there are outbreaks, and you also have resources and supplies from all around the country going to different cities, going to different provinces to help fight the pandemic as well. So again, the sort of whole of government approach, sort of very unified approach in terms of tackling the pandemic from the grassroots level to the city level, to the provincial level, and to the central level as well. Shamim, oh, you raised your hand. Did you want to add on that a little bit?
Yeah, if I would like to chime on to what Adam just said, yeah, I would definitely agree that there were a lot of like misconceptions and negative perspectives at the initial stage. And I would like to particularly point to one thing here, that with the pandemic, there was also one phenomenon that was going around, is the infodemic. That is like a lot of information, plethora of information, but we cannot distinguish between which is correct and which is wrong. And I would agree that, yeah, it was our responsibility as foreigners to, go on and try to dispel these misconceptions. And I remember, like, at the initial stage, some of the television channels from my home country, they were like very curious to know what was going on in China, and they were asking me like, what's happening, and is it like how dangerous it is, because they did not know about the magnitude of the outbreak. And I was categorically telling them that it is really, really unfair to blame China just because of the outbreak. And I even went on to say that the world owes it to China, because the way, how China played an essential role in providing medical supplies or equipment to other countries, despite facing its own challenges. China like donated medical supplies, or, like the personal protective equipment, PPE kits. And this is something that the world should appreciate about China, definitely. And I think China definitely played an important role as a responsible global citizen in the world.
Yeah, I think definitely China provided a lot of medical supplies, especially to developing countries around the world. Kate, maybe I want to come to you and get your thoughts in terms of perhaps changes in behavior, changes in lifestyles and habits that you experienced during the pandemic, and maybe you carried on today. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you. Just to jump on what everyone just said, I had a quite different experience during the pandemic because I went back home, and Belarus was one of the very few countries in the world that did not take any measures. So people did not wear masks. We did not have any vaccines. Everyone went to school and work. And it was very unusual for me to come back to China in 2021 and experience all of that, all of the measures. But when I went back, actually, a lot of my classmates and friends were asking me how to get back. Everyone wanted to be here in China. And I want to say that as a media student and, an aspiring media worker, I had the chance to film documentaries and to be a host for TV programs and talk about China organizing Gaokao, the hardest, high school exam during the pandemic, right? And all the students, all the teachers paying a lot of attention and taking all the measures to smoothly organize this exam. So I was at the venue seeing how everything was organized very smoothly. Alina made a great point about Chinese teachers, who I really think that they are heroes. They helped us to go through this hard period. But I have to mention that students also played a very important role in building this sense of community and helping each other. Because us as students, we were volunteers. For instance, me as a student, I was the one helping to take PCR tests. I was the one guiding the students through, daily PCR test procedures, talking to international students to, help them feel a bit better mentally, helping the international students office and students to connect better. And I think that's a very important, bonding part of connecting people to each other. Yeah, so that was my experience. But now 2022 was very challenging. Now we're in 2023. And I must say that this has been the best winter break I've ever had in my life. I traveled to Yunnan, Harbin, Hong Kong, China. We've been to all of these different provinces around China. And this semester, next month, I'm going to be out of Beijing for 15 days during various field trips. So everything has basically come back to life. Everything's coming back. Everyone is so happy about it. We're so excited that we can actually go and explore China as we are part of the China Studies program.
Joseph, I'm going to come to you in just a second. You have so much, I think, to reflect upon. But Gisela here wants to add something to what all of our guests said. So, Joseph, I'm going to come back to you right after Gisela and then get your reflections on all of this. Go for it, Gisela.
First, you have to really try the very cold winter of Harbin. It is amazing.
You've tried it too?
I had the chance to be there and it was amazing. So I add to that team.
Yeah.
Well, where my colleagues were talking and sharing their experiences, there was an example that came back to my mind, which was my first birthday in China.
Yeah.
It was just a few weeks after arriving here. In this context, I said, well, it was a bit, we can say, scary or creepy at the beginning because the roads were pretty empty or not crowded. And in those days where I was still adjusting to this new life here, all the measures to prevent the spread of the virus, I started to get sick. I had a fever and headache, and I immediately felt very scared. And in this community feeling or this community organization that you were mentioning, the security guard from the community show up and say, okay, let's measure your temperature. And I had a little fever, so they took me to the hospital. It was actually a guard that was next to the community, so they were not receiving patients, but they made sure that I actually had a fever. So afterwards, they took me together to another hospital, and by that time, the PCR test technology was not well developed or as developed as it is now, so you can get a result in an hour. By that time, it was some as 24 hours or 30 hours or something like that. And they say, okay, no worries, we're gonna conduct a blood test on you and an x-ray on the chest and see if you have any symptoms of COVID. So the thing is that within 1.5 hours, I already had a result that it was not COVID, but it was food poisoning.
Oh, I see. Well, that's good.
Yeah, it was good. It was not COVID, just food poisoning. But I remember that after that, I called my mom and I say, hey, mom, I have bad and good news. The bad news is that I'm at hospital because I got food poisoning. But the good news is that this is not COVID, and mom, you don't know, you're not gonna believe how they took care of me. And actually being there when I was in the call with my mom, the people from the first hospital, the first ward, but they took my temperature, they called to the second hospital to make sure that I was there and that it was not COVID. And it was, impressive. It blew my mind because I was thinking, my God, such a populous country, and they are still taking care of each single person as unique, as trying to avoid that if I was actually infected with COVID, I was not infecting everybody in my community. So yeah, that example came out when my colleagues were talking about their experiences, and I wanted to share this with you. Of course, not the best birthday in my life, having food poisoning, but grateful discovering this collective and community organization of China that is just impressive. And until nowadays, it blows my mind.
Yeah. We do have to remember that this is the most populous nation on the planet, right? Over 1.4 billion people, and it's not easy. It's not easy to manage the pandemic in such a large country, such a population-dense country as well. I mean, here in this city, we've got 20 million plus people, right? A city here in China with a few million people is considered sort of a smaller, medium-sized city. So in terms of the organizational capabilities and ability to control outbreaks so it doesn't spread fast, because if it does, it spreads very fast. We've seen the subways here in Beijing and some of the larger cities, how crowded it can be. So that's why I think China is so adamant that we got to control the outbreak at its beginning and at its initial stages, so not all people will get infected. You wanted to add something as well, Marco?
No, it's just, I think, a general thought, because I think this has to do with the capacity of the Communist Party of China to really organize society. Because, I mean, if you have a challenge like COVID, it's not so, I mean, in some ways, not so different from what was the poverty alleviation campaign. I mean, the party is able to mobilize the whole society for one target in the different levels. And also, I mean, the capacity of learning, because during the whole pandemic, you have different stages of the pandemic and different learnings. I remember, for instance, one story in Beijing, I think it was still 2020, that one person went to the hospital with fever, was Mr. Tang, and okay, he had got fever, so they started to do research. Okay, they tested positive. So with the cell phone, they were able to track all the steps of Mr. Tang in the last 2 weeks. And then finally, after 24 hours, they found out he was infected in Shifadi, the big wholesale market. And then with that, they closed the surroundings and they controlled the pandemic in Beijing, and they tested everybody in the city in 7 days. And if you get 2 years later, when you had for instance, the outbreak in Guangzhou, they were able to test 18 million people in 3 or 4 days.
Right.
So, I mean, all the learning also experience of Chinese officials, Chinese authorities, health authorities in this 2 or 3 years was amazing. And at the end of the day, what you get now from China is that, I mean, many specialists, they think that other pandemics will come. And guess what? Which is the only country in the world who now has a knowledge accumulated to deal with the pandemic. I mean, the capacity of doing tests in everybody, 1.4 billion people, each 72 hours, this is amazing. And of course, I mean, this is not a good news for us, but when another pandemic comes, the world will definitely need to learn with China, because it's the only country who, at the end of the day, had a real experience of how to deal with the pandemic.
I think you mentioned some very interesting points, Marco, some very important points in terms of China's ability to contact trace, the precision in terms of being able to identify the relevant people and making sure other people are safe. And that experience, that wealth of experience in terms of how to deal with pandemics, because experts around the world say, you know, we have to draw experiences from this one so we can be better prepared for the next one, especially in a world where I feel, you know, we have tensions rising, differences in opinion. So the ability of a nation to be able to deal with the pandemic, I think is very important. That wealth of experience that China has is incredible. Joseph, I want to come to you. You have a tall order because, first of all, thank you for your patience. We have so many guests today, so I don't think we can divide up the answers evenly. But if you have any reflections on what other people have said, and perhaps maybe do a little compare and contrast with us in terms of how China handled the pandemic, how maybe Cameroon and Africa handled the pandemic. So the floor is yours, Joseph. Go for it.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. First of all, I want to say that the COVID pandemic was a latecomer in Africa because, for example, in Cameroon, only around late March that we had our first declared cases. So I was in China when that happened, and I decided not to go back because if we go back to the history, in Africa, in West Africa, we also had the yellow fever, and China was actually among one of the only development partners that actually assisted us. So it was a way to also stay here and work together with the Chinese youth to see what we can do and also to learn. I agree with the last speaker. So what I will resonate with what Kate just said. At Peking University, not only students, but also the youth, because there is also community leaders. So for example, I would translate Chinese measures into French or German, into African languages, because not only the Chinese local residents had to follow the rules, but we also had to make sure that us, the foreign students living in China, that we also behave properly, or we also make sure that our actions don't affect the others. So bringing back to because in 2021, I also visited 10 counties, within the pandemic. So it was also in a way to volunteer, to give away, to give my help, but also to learn. In 2021, I've been to Zhejiang, I've been to Shanxi, and I realized how developed Zhejiang was. The last speaker just mentioned about tracing and scanning the QR code actually started in Zhejiang and actually spread throughout China. So I realized that, and it was a good learning materials. I was also in 2021, I went to Shanxi. I served as a village official. So I was actually following the village, I would say, we call that the village chief if we refer to Cameroon. And I stood there for quite some time, and I saw how actually they were handling the pandemic, but not that 2021 is also an important year for China. They have alleviated extreme poverty. They mentioned that. So, it was a two-in-one kind of experience for me to see how, the Chinese are coming together, how the Chinese government is putting the people at the center. Getting to the Wuhan example, two hospital, we all know, two hospital built in a week. That was actually a very, I would say, impressive achievement, a remarkable effort from China, not only in terms of public health, but also in terms of logistics, in planning and architecture. And for me, coming from Africa, that was very important. And what I did actually was to take all of that Chinese measures and to bring all of my community. So we translated that in pretty much all of the African languages to share that, because back home, the measures were not very developed. So we still had to learn. You still had to get information back then about what is the pandemic, how to avoid it, how to make sure that I'm safe. So we translated that into African local languages so as to get aware, the community aware. You have to know that Africa is a young continent, the youth. We have a little rough 70% that are actually less than 25 of age, less than 25. So the African 1.4 billion, the whole continent, but it's very young. So the young people had to be aware. What is the pandemic? What do I have to do to be safe, but also, in terms of Africa-China partnership, we're also very grateful to China, because while fighting the pandemic, in the Chinese territory, China also donated a lot, governmental, or it might be in terms of government, or in terms of even the private sectors, even individuals donating a lot of kits, a lot of materials to African, to African nations. And I will also mention the vaccines, right? Donating a lot of vaccines. And lately, China also completed the Africa CDC in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. That's a very good news for Africa, because China is actually trying to help us to manufacture vaccines in Africa to solve that issue, because that when it comes to Africa, in terms of vaccines, there have been a lot of issues, because not many people were getting vaccines when we refer to previous pandemics. But now we have the AU CDC in Ethiopia, and then we will be able to manufacture vaccines and to solve those issues. So basically, that's actually what I wanted to mention for those issues.
Yeah, so important to manufacture these vaccines locally. Joseph, I want to get your take in terms of perhaps how rural China managed the pandemic and how urban areas did as well, because you said you actually served as a village official in China as well. And we know, of course, China eradicated absolute poverty during the pandemic years. And I think the Chinese government was also very adamant in making sure that the pandemic does not overly affect China's rural areas and make sure the poverty alleviation initiatives remain on track. So what kind of differences did you see in rural and urban China in terms of fighting the pandemic?
Fundamentally, I think there is no big difference because I think from my perspective, I saw a line. Whatever is decided at the top level, let's say in Beijing, is also, immediately, it gets immediately to the grassroots level. So that actually what struck my my curiosity. How come, in such a fast speed? So I would see the same measures, right? The same measures that are left in Beijing at the county level. Of course, you will say that at the county, it's not as industrialized, but not really. Villagers, I used to live with them. Villagers were actually pretty much aware. And actually, the digital, we went, the whole country and even the whole world went digital, as well as the counties actually, because we talk about now rural revitalization, right? So they also actually pretty much incorporated the whole idea, but then through the village officials, because in every village there are young people. The village official that I was following just graduated from university in Beijing, and then he went there to be a village official in Shahaozuan. That was like volunteering work. So it was very appealing how young Chinese were willing to contribute to not only to contain the pandemic, but also to contribute their wisdom to bring the counties level to the same situation at the city. So of course, in metropolis like Beijing, Shanghai, it went faster. But then at the county level, the only or the biggest challenge that I saw was actually the population, because they were most the elderly people, living in Chinese. So they needed support from the youth. And that's why those young officials were sent to the county levels. And I really commend such movement, and I was really struck. But also unity, because the way the young people, the village official, connected or interacted with the villagers were actually like brothers, and they actually mastered every single informations, because we went through, for example, in Shahao County, we went through 200 actually villages, house by house, to just investigate how are you doing, do you have any problem, do you have any issue. And those village officials, they actually knew every single information, and that's how they managed actually to know what were the problem, to know what the population needed, to be able to feed back to actually the relevant institutions. And for me, that was actually a great learning experience as well.
Yeah. Great reflections, great insights, Joseph. I think that's also a very uniquely Chinese point in terms of, if you want to serve in government, if you want to engage in public service here in China, there is a massive campaign and initiative to encourage young people who graduated from public policy and public administration degrees to really serve at the grassroots level first, and then move your way up. I actually met one village official who is in his mid-20s, and actually his WeChat name is directly, "If you need any help, please contact me." That is his actual WeChat social media name. So in terms of what you said, getting to know all the villagers, getting to know their basic needs, what they need in life, etc., that's definitely what they need to do. And they train with local village officials as well, sort of like an apprenticeship or a mentorship program, where some of the best university graduates go to the grassroots and local levels and train from the grassroots level up, manage maybe at the village level, then move up to county, township, city, province, and then the central government. So I think that's also quite a unique Chinese government governance perspective. Adam, I'm going to come to you, and Kate, maybe you can wrap us up with your final thoughts. But Adam, I want to come to you, maybe get your thoughts on your post-COVID plans here in China. I mean, do you plan to stay in China for the near term and intermediate term as well? What do you think?
Because I go to your question, actually, everything you say here, it's great. And remember us about what happening during the last 3 years. So first, I want to say something about like how many people out of China, because also I did thousands of interviews at the time, and people ask and media ask. So many questions. It's like what we are explaining now, how China did all this, how they control the situation with this huge population, like Wuhan, 11 million, how people stay home for 3 months. It's not easy to understand. For example, for me, in 22 January 2020, when they said like they will close Wuhan, for me, it's like how they will close Wuhan. It's a very big city. We can control such kind of cities. But really, in 23 January morning, all people are at home. So why? How they did this, For me, I all time answer that if there is secret here in China about how they did this, it was a people struggle. It was like the trust and harmony between people and government. People trust government here so much, and they know that government have a plan for everything. They prepare themselves for such kind of situation. They learn from 2003 pandemic. So they believe on science. We all remember, like in many countries, how they don't believe in science. They give some suggestions, which is incredible.
Shamim, okay, this is really the last word. I want to give you the final word and the final wrap up before we sign off here.
Okay. Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure to hear all of your insightful thoughts. Well, so first of all, my plan in the post-pandemic era is definitely to travel. This is something I have been tempting for long, and I really want to travel across China. Now that finally I have got a chance. And then secondly, I want to definitely, because as a media person, I definitely want to explore some more stories about China so that I can communicate the China story better with the rest of the world. And I have definitely requested my editor to send me on some business trips across China so that I can go and identify some stories and tell the China story and tell it well. And definitely, like the pandemic has been definitely a eye-opening experience for me. And as I already mentioned at the beginning, it was something that kind of enhanced the human spirit, the spirit of togetherness, the spirit of solidarity. And it also showed that how the world is again a global village connected with one another, and we may be from different countries, but somehow as human beings we are made from the same thread, from the same cloth. We are cut from the same cloth. So it shows us the importance of solidarity, especially in times like pandemic or in times of this global health emergency. So I think, as you said, that even I'm optimistic about the world, how things will pan out from here, and I'm keeping fingers crossed that even in the future, if we have such a health emergency, we can again act to solidarity and we can battle it, and we can weather through the challenges together.
Yeah, absolutely. I think China's messages when it comes to solidarity, like you mentioned, Shamim, when it comes to cooperation, when it comes to mutual benefit, when it comes to win-win, I think these messages from China has been consistent despite whatever tensions that we see in the world. So I think China has also said that it will open more and more to the world. These messages, I think, are extremely important, no matter how difficult of a situation the world is currently in. So Shamim, thank you so much for your thoughts on that. And again, I just want to reiterate, if you really want to understand China, you have to be in this country, right? You can definitely, listen and look at media from all around the world, but if you truly want to come to understand China, you have to be here and experience life a little bit more here in this country. Fantastic discussions, fantastic insights. Thank you so much to all of our guests online and here in the studio as well. Thank you, Gisela. Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Alina. Thank you, Kate, Alberto, Joseph, Shamim, and Adam. Fantastic conversation. Great to have you on the program. So again, I want to thank all of our panelists today for sharing their professional experiences as young expats living here in China during the pandemic. I definitely feel their insights into the unique challenges, but also opportunities that arose during this difficult time have been truly illuminating, and we certainly hope that our audience abroad has gained a deeper understanding of real life here in China. I'm Michael Wong here in Beijing. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.